Sherman told his officers exactly how John Bell Hood would destroy the Confederate Army of Tennessee. He laid out every move, every mistake, every catastrophe. He was right about all of it, and before Hood was finished, 30,000 Confederate soldiers were dead, wounded, or gone, victims not of a superior enemy, but of their own commander's character. This is the story of the most precise prediction in American military history, and the men who died because nobody on the southern side knew Hood the way Sherman did. On July 17, 1864, a telegram reached William Tecumseh Sherman outside Atlanta. The news was momentous. The cautious Joseph Johnston had been sacked. In his place, Jefferson Davis elevated John Bell Hood to command the Confederacy's last great Western Army. Sherman didn't celebrate. He called his generals into a tent and issued a chillingly clinical assessment. He had known Hood since their days at West Point. He had watched him at mess tables and on parade grounds. Sherman's warning was this: Hood was bold to the point of rashness. He would strike without hesitation, and he would do so because he believed in the frontal assault, the way other men believed in God. Hood, Sherman predicted, would abandon his works and attack. For the Army of Tennessee, this wasn't a promotion, it was a countdown to oblivion. What Sherman understood was that aggression in the wrong hands isn't a virtue, it's a liability. John Bell Hood, a Kentuckian by birth and a Texan by choice, was a man defined by a physical hunger that his peers couldn't quite name. He graduated near the bottom of his West Point class in 1853. He was never an intellectual, he was a force. In the peacetime Army of Texas, Hood built a reputation for raw, violent bravery. In 1857, he famously charged a vastly superior Comanche force, taking an arrow through the hand. In the culture of the frontier cavalry, the charge was the only argument that mattered. The problem, as Sherman saw it, was that the tactics of a border skirmish do not scale to the management of 60,000 lives against a modern industrial war machine. When the Civil War broke out, Hood's rise was meteoric. Leading the Texas Brigade in Virginia, he became the Confederacy's premier shock trooper. But the cost was written on his body. At Gettysburg, a shell fragment mangled his left arm, leaving it withered forever. 2 months later at Chickamauga, a musket ball shattered his right leg, requiring amputation at the mid-thigh. By 1864, Hood was a torso strapped to a horse. He had given the war 2 limbs and was prepared to give it the rest. Sherman watched this transformation from across the lines, noting that Hood's relationship with reality was becoming selective. He could visualize an attack, but he couldn't grasp the mathematical certainty of its failure. Hood took command on July 18th. Sherman immediately wrote to Grant, predicting an attack within 48 hours. He was exactly right. On July 20th, the Battle of Peachtree Creek began. It was Hood's debut as an army commander, and it revealed the flaw in his soul. On paper, the plan to catch the Union Army while crossing a creek was sound. In execution, it was a disaster. Hood's units moved late and out of sync. They ran into George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, who repulsed the disorganized rebel waves with ease. Hood recorded it as an inconclusive contest. Sherman recorded it as confirmation. 2 days later, Hood lunged again. He sent his corps on a grueling night march to hit the Union rear. The fighting was some of the most desperate of the war. It cost the North General James McPherson, Sherman's closest friend and protege. Sherman wept on a cracker box when he heard the news, but the grief didn't paralyze him. It accelerated him. Hood had aimed for a knockout blow, but achieved only a bloodbath. He had damaged the Union army, but he was consuming his own. At the Battle of Ezra Church a week later, Hood threw his men against Union works 5 times. They were repulsed 5 times. In 8 days, Hood had lost 13,000 men. He blamed his subordinates for the failure. He couldn't see that the failure was the plan itself. By August, Sherman had seen enough. He didn't need to trade lives in frontal assaults. He simply cut the railroads. When the last line at Jonesboro snapped, Atlanta became a cage. Hood evacuated on September 1st, blowing up his own ammunition trains in explosions that could be heard for miles. Atlanta had fallen. Lincoln's re-election was secured. The strategic catastrophe the South feared was now a reality. But Hood was not done. If you enjoy stories like this, please hit the like button and subscribe. It helps the channel a lot. Desperate to regain the initiative, Hood proposed a wild gamble. He would march north into Tennessee, cut Sherman's supply lines, and force a battle on his own terms. Sherman made a cold, calculated decision. He didn't follow Hood. Instead, he sent George Thomas to Nashville with enough men to handle the reckless Southerner, while Sherman himself turned his back on the enemy and began his scorched earth march to the sea. Sherman's decision was an explicit judgment. He knew Hood would eventually destroy himself. He didn't need to be there to see it happen. The end began at Spring Hill, Tennessee, on November 29, 1864. Hood had the Union Army trapped in a narrow corridor. The orders were given to block the road. Then, for reasons that remain a mystery of history, the Confederate Army simply stopped. As the rebels slept, the entire Union Army marched past them in the dark. Confederate officers later reported hearing the rumble of Union wagons and the shuffling of thousands of feet just yards from their campfires. They whispered to each other that the Yankees were escaping, but the news never moved the high command. By dawn, the trap was empty. Hood woke to find his prize gone. What followed was the most consequential tantrum in military history. Humiliated and enraged, he accused his army of cowardice. He decided he would make them fight it out. The Union Army was dug in at Franklin behind formidable works with a river at their back. To reach them, Hood's men had to cross 2 miles of open field in broad daylight. It was suicide. General Patrick Cleburne, the Stonewall of the West, begged Hood to reconsider. Hood refused. At 4 p.m., 20,000 Confederates stepped off into a frontal assault, larger and more desperate than Pickett's charge. For 5 hours, the fields of Franklin became a slaughterhouse. The rebels actually breached the center, but without support, they were cut down in a killing ground of hand-to-hand combat. By nightfall, the Army of Tennessee was a corpse. 7,000 men were casualties, but the true horror was the officer corps. 6 Confederate generals were killed in a single afternoon: Cleburne, Adams, Gist, Granbury, Strahl, and Carter. In 4 years of war, the entire Union Army lost fewer generals in action than Hood lost in 5 hours. The brain of the Western Army had been burned away in a fit of pique. The remnants of the army followed Hood to Nashville, where they sat in the frozen mud, dwindling from cold and desertion. George Thomas, the methodical executioner, waited until his logistics were perfect. When he finally struck on December 15th, it wasn't a battle. It was a rout. The Army of Tennessee ceased to exist as a military force. Men fled south across the ice, a ghost army that would never fight again. Hood resigned in January 1865. Sherman had been right about everything. He knew Hood's pattern because he had seen the man behind the uniform. He understood that the tools of a bold colonel are a catastrophe for a general. Sherman's greatness wasn't just his logistics, it was his self-knowledge. Hood lacked this. In his post-war memoirs, Hood blamed everyone: Johnston's retreats, his subordinates' failures, his men's lack of spirit. He couldn't admit the truth Sherman had seen in a tent in Georgia months earlier. The tragedy of the Western theatre was that the South put its fate in the hands of a man whose character made defeat a mathematical certainty. Sherman saw the end before it began, not on a map, but in the soul of his enemy. And as he marched through the Carolinas to end the war, he knew that the final cost was exactly what he had predicted. If you want more stories like this, the ones that explain how wars are really won and lost, like and subscribe to this channel. We'll see you in the next one.